Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this exciting online event. My name is Max Bergmann, and I am the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program in the Stuart Center and Euro-Atlantic and Northern European Studies here at the Center for Strategic International Studies. And I'm honored to have here Ambassador David Quarrey, who currently is serving as the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to NATO. We're here to have a hot wash discussion about the recent NATO summit that just wrapped up here in Washington last week, and we'll discuss what highlights came out of the summit and Ambassador Quarrey's reflections on its successes, its deliverables, and sort of what's next for the NATO alliance. Before we start, let me introduce him briefly. Ambassador Quarrey was appointed as the UK's permanent representative to NATO in April 2022, and before this, Ambassador Quarrey served as the Prime Minister's advisor on international affairs and Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2022, and as British Ambassador to Israel from 2015 to 2019. He's had a long and storied career in the UK government. And so without further ado, it is my immense pleasure to introduce and to have UK Permanent Representative to NATO, Ambassador David Quarrey. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador.
No, thanks, Max. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let me start with, we only ask really tough questions here at CSIS. So let me start by saying, after a week in Washington in July, when you returned to Brussels, did you appreciate the Belgian weather much more than you did before being in Washington in July?
Well, the rain was coming down, and we knew we were in a different country. And frankly, after a few days of mid-90s temperatures and trying to move around a gridlock Washington, there was a slight sense of relief that we were back in European temperatures and precipitation.
Yes, I think for us Americans that live in DC in the summer, it was sort of, we both sort of enjoyed seeing a lot of the European sweat, but then there was both complaints about the heat, but also about our air conditioning, which we have difficulty fathom. But let me maybe ask you, the UK now has a new prime minister. You had elections on our Independence Day on July 4th, and I'm curious if maybe you could give us sort of a behind-the-scenes look at how, you're an ambassador preparing for this historic NATO summit, 75 years of NATO here in Washington. And, on July 3rd, you don't quite know who will be the prime minister, or maybe, you could read the polls. But to have a government go through a transition in the matter of, I guess it happens overnight in a day, seems rather difficult to plan for these summits. Take me through, how did that work? And maybe you can give sort of behind the scenes of what was it like the month or weeks before the summit for you?
Well, it was because Washington, the Washington summit was always going to be a massive deal for us as the 75th anniversary summit and as a really important moment in this kind of difficult international environment. But it did have this added spice for us of our election on the 4th. I mean, the good thing there is that our system, if there is a clear result, as there was on the 4th of July, our system moves very quickly. We had a new prime minister by the 4th. We had new senior ministers in place, and in some cases traveling by the 5th. So over that weekend of the 6th and the 7th, we had the defense secretary in Odessa meeting President Zelensky. We had the foreign secretary in Berlin, Warsaw, and Stockholm. We had the Prime Minister setting direction for his new government. So it can happen very, very quickly, as it did this time round. But in the run-up, we had to make sure that we still had a government and we were delivering existing government policy. But we always just had to keep a weather eye on what might be the scenario after the 4th of July. And fortunately, there is considerable consensus within the UK system about support for NATO, support for Ukraine. So we were working within reasonable parameters. But then very quickly on the 5th of July, you start looking at the draft interventions for the Prime Minister in the 3 sessions of the North Atlantic Council, thinking, okay, we've got to make sure that these are right for him and right for his party, right for his government. So there was quite a lot of work. But you are allowed under our system to start talking to a possible future prime minister and his team in the run-up. So we had some signals, but inevitably it meant that quite a lot happened quite late in the day. But actually, it was a brilliant opportunity for the new government to come and signal their commitment to NATO, to meet 31 of their new closest friends, lots of NATO partners as well, and really to project on the international stage.
And it also meant that meeting with the Prime Minister and other UK officials suddenly became sort of the hot ticket in town, so to speak. Not that meeting with the UK is not always a priority, but the president had a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and I think that was one of the only bilateral meetings that occurred. I'm curious, what was that just sort of a meet and greet? How did you prepare for those sorts of meetings, and also with the new Defense Secretary Healy, who is in town? Just days to prepare. Were you all ready to set these things up and just move at warp speed?
So it was actually a really substantive bilateral meeting at the White House that the Prime Minister had with President Biden, and they really covered a good chunk of the globe in the talks they had there before the big ceremonial dinner. And one of the very striking things as an official supporting the Prime Minister and the Foreign and Defence Secretaries was how well prepared they were. They've been working toward this for a long time. They have a lot of relationships in Washington and in other allied capitals. And they were absolutely determined to hit the ground running. This wasn't just going to be about non-substantive introductory meetings. They wanted to get on with business right from the very start. And obviously for an official like me, that's kind of fantastic news. Mm-hmm. And you're right. I think they were a very hot ticket in Washington. A lot of people wanted to hear what they had to say about NATO specifically, international security more generally, but also just to get a sense of the new government's priorities.
Yes, and I can attest to that. We both hosted the new Defense Secretary and Foreign Secretary here at CSIS on a few occasions, and they made sure to kind of really touch base here in Washington in the run-up to the election. Let me maybe ask you for kind of your broad takeaways on this NATO summit, and then we can maybe dissect them individually. But what is your sort of view on how was this summit? Was it a successful summit? What sort of came out of it?
Yeah, so I think it was a big success. And for us, it worked at three different levels. Firstly, it was an important moment to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the world's most successful, longest-lived alliance. And we need to remind ourselves sometimes what a unique thing this is, that 32 allies have come together freely, making a solemn commitment through Article 5 to collective defence. And that's really the bedrock of our freedoms and our ability to live according to our values. So it was important to mark that moment, to pay tribute to Stoltenberg's 10 years of truly outstanding leadership of the alliance, to look forward to Mark Rutte's arrival. And the US did a tremendous job of the ceremonial elements, and we really felt that was appropriately marked during the 3 days of the summit. But we always wanted this to be about substance as well as celebration. So I think our second success was that we delivered a really substantive package from the summit, whether on deterrence and defense, on Russia, on support to Ukraine in particular, some clear messages on China, but also lots of work in building our global partnerships. We had the Indo-Pacific 4 leaders there for the third summit in a row, and lots of work on things like hybrid, AI, new technologies to help prepare the alliance for the world of the future, for the challenges coming towards us. And then kind of the third success for us was, as I mentioned earlier, that opportunity for our government to state its unshakable commitment to NATO, to start talking about the strategic defence review that we've launched this week, and for the Prime Minister and other ministers to make clear how committed we are and that defence is going to be a really high priority for them.
Before going to some of the NATO deliverables, maybe I could ask you just on the UK strategic defence review that has just been announced. Now, here in Washington, it seems like there's been a lot of UK strategic defence reviews, understanding that this is a new government. Is this sort of repeating what has happened before, or is this kind of a new effort? Maybe you could just explain that, and then we'll get to some of the NATO business.
It is a new effort, and the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary have been very clear that they want to take a fundamental look at the world that we find ourselves in now, and whether we have the right kinds of capabilities, how we need to continue investing, how we build a pathway to 2.5% of GDP on defence investment. Critically, how we re-energise, rebuild our defence industrial base for the new challenges that we face, both in terms of restocking ourselves, working with allies, but also continuing to support Ukraine. We have had a number of reviews in recent years, but I think that is a reflection of the pace at which the international security environment has deteriorated in recent years. And I think after 14 years in opposition, the government are now very clear that they want to take their own look at this, bring in external expertise, as they've already done, and really start examining from the bottom up what is required for the coming period.
So, to get to the NATO summit, this summit struck me as kind of a no-drama summit. When I think about last year at Vilnius, there was a lot of acrimony over Ukraine membership. I think it's fairly clear that the White House here in the United States felt fairly blindsided by how aggressively Ukraine membership was pushed, not just by Ukraine, but by other NATO members, particularly Baltic states. And it seemed like really wanted to kind of wrap everything up very quickly. It didn't seem like there was a lot of drama, at least publicly. And so I guess my question to you, to maybe start with before we get into the nitty gritty, is: was there sort of drama happening behind the scenes? Were there certain tough fights over certain issues? What was sort of keeping you burn the midnight oil late into the before the NATO's statements were released?
So there had been a phenomenal amount of work done in the weeks leading up to the summit. I've lost track of how many hours went into the negotiation of the summit declaration, of important bits of substance elsewhere. But I think it was a success this year in terms of getting so much of that preparatory work done in advance of the summit, and having some really candid conversations, both within the alliance and with Ukrainian partners and others attending the summit, just to make sure that we were all on the same page going into Washington, because we really wanted to project, as I think we successfully did, a message about unity and resolve, NATO being bigger, stronger, readier than it has ever been. And I think we were successful in that. As an official, you always want as much of this to be locked down before principles start arriving at the summit. But there were still a few issues to be finally pinned down when we were in Washington. But we were able to do that in a way that contained any differences, found a solution, and kept us united both internally and projecting publicly.
So maybe let's turn to the issue of Ukraine. I had heard from administration folks a few months before the summit, before the U.S. had passed its supplemental, that they were actually quite worried that this would be a summit dominated by Ukraine. Not the question of Ukrainian membership, but of the situation on the ground, that Ukraine would be really on the back foot and would be on the cusp of defeat. And this would be a summit about saving Ukraine. I think U.S. funding has kicked in, aid is there, the front lines have sort of stabilized. And it seems like the conversation about membership was sort of put to bed very early. What do you think were the kind of main outcomes when it comes to Ukraine and Ukraine support?
So I think a couple of things were very clear as we, in the run-up to the summit. One was that after a very difficult period on the battlefield, that the Ukrainians, through their own bravery and courage and actions, but also as the US supplemental funding kicked in, as other support came through, they had, as you say, stabilized the battlefield and were making the Russians pay an unbelievably high price for very small incremental gains in terms of territory. But at the same time, the Russians were striking, including the truly appalling attack on the children's hospital. And so you could see whether it was infrastructure or other civilian targets, the Ukrainians were paying themselves a heavy price there. So I think one of the key conclusions for everybody running into Washington was that we had to focus on practical support. The words in the communique would be important, new processes would be important, but that without concrete steps forward, particularly in terms of air defence, then that would be a hollow outcome. So I think one of the successes of Washington was to manage both, with the announcements of the Patriots, F-16s being pretty much ready to go in. There was a lot practically there, new announcements from us and other allies as well. There was a lot of substance that the Ukrainians could focus on and reassure their public that all that support was coming. But then I think we did take some important decisions about building out NATO's role in support of Ukraine, and particularly the new NATO mission for Ukraine, taking on a coordinating role for provision of training and equipment. That is a very significant evolution of NATO's role in support of Ukraine. We've got that, plus we've got a new senior civilian representative who will be heading up the NATO office in Kyiv. We have got the financial pledge committing that all of us would invest at least 40 billion euros in Ukraine this year, and that we continue on a long-term basis. And then we've got membership language in the declaration and in the joint statement with the Ukrainians, making clear that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to membership. So I think if you put all that together alongside the practical support, that is then a very substantive package for Ukraine.
Let me maybe ask you about the mission, the Security Assistance Coordination Mission. That I forget what the acronym is. It's a terrible acronym, but I can't quite remember it. But to NATO sort of getting involved in coordinating aid to Ukraine, I guess my question is, what problem is this supposed to fix? And my understanding is that the U.S. was sort of playing this role. Were there deficiencies in U.S. coordination? And is this sort of a case of NATO just sort of wanting to get into the game of really supporting Ukraine after kind of being on the sidelines? Why is this significant?
So the US are doing an amazing job in coordinating, leading the international coalition in support of Ukraine. But particularly as time has gone on, and we've seen a number of different initiatives, for example, with training the Ukrainians, we've got Interflex that the UK has led, we've got the EU mission on this, we've got all the US efforts, but also on the equipment supply side as well. There's always a risk of fragmentation of those efforts. And we've got a particular ambition to make sure that all of this support increasingly makes Ukraine interoperable with the alliance and helps prepare Ukraine for future membership of the alliance. So that's why I think it's important to move from what have been very effective but ad hoc structures towards something which is firmly rooted in NATO. Because both on the substance and the signalling, this is all about helping them prepare for their future membership. So it makes sense that we can deploy all of that expertise that NATO has on things like training equipment programs and make sure that is plugging into the Ukrainians in a way that brings them ever closer to membership. So it's not that there was a deficiency in the US-led effort, which was fantastic, but more about putting in a long-term footing with the arrow very firmly pointing toward NATO membership.
Let me ask you about the Ukraine compact that was announced with, I think, great fanfare with the countries that have signed on to or reached bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. I believe there's more than 20 NATO countries that have done so. And I think the UK was the first, if correct me if I'm wrong, to reach a bilateral security agreement with Ukraine. Are these significant, these agreements? What sort of significance do you place on the Ukraine compact? And is that sort of an important sort of bridge, perhaps, to NATO membership, that it provides something, some tangible benefits to Ukraine now versus just waiting for membership? Maybe you could unpack the bilateral security agreements in the Ukraine compact that was announced.
No, I think these agreements are significant, and I think it was very helpful at Washington that we brought all those countries together. As you say, we were the first in the UK to sign ours with the Ukrainians. And I see it in our own system that the framework that we've set out in our bilateral security agreement helps us shape our future plans for support to Ukraine, and I think that's true for other allies as well. It also helps us look across the piece at who is doing what, who is committing in which areas, who might focus more in some areas in the future. But there's also that reassurance to the Ukrainians, which is very important, that in any future conflict, we would come to their assistance again in terms of military equipment, training and provision, as we have done since 2022. And indeed, with the UK's case, long before 2022 as well. So I think they are significant. And I see the benefit in our system from having that ambition and clarity. And as I understand it, talking to colleagues here, they find the same in their own systems as well.
Maybe let me switch gears to the deterrence and defense conversation. Now, this, I think, from the public side, being on the outside, sort of hard to assess. 2 years ago, NATO agreed to a new strategic concept at the NATO Summit in Madrid. That was a big deal. NATO usually once a decade agrees to a new strategic concept. Last year at Vilnius, NATO agreed to regional plans, to essentially the plans to implement the strategic concept. And this year strikes me in some ways as a year NATO might have actually skipped having a summit, because there was 2 big years where things were agreed to. NATO summits used to not be every year. But this sort of was a temperature check of how NATO is doing implementing the regional plans that are classified. And so, folks on the outside like me can't really see. So I guess, how do you assess NATO's, is NATO on course to defend the alliance? And how would you assess the deterrence and defense aspects of the summit and of where NATO is right now? And if I characterize anything incorrectly, or you want to quibble with my characterization, please do.
Well, you're right in an important sense that deterrence and defense is not an event. It doesn't happen. We don't have like the plans and the force model and everybody contributing kind of all in one summit and then that is done forever. It is a continuous process, and we have constant meetings about force generation, about assessing how we are doing against the various capabilities that SACEUR requires to deliver the plans. And I think it was very important for leaders, for people at that level, to check in on how are we doing on that. And I think the message is, the outcome is, that we have made really great progress. These plans have been delivered much faster than was envisaged when they were first contemplated a few years back. The force generation process has really given SACEUR a much clearer picture of what forces he has available, with which capabilities, what levels of readiness, physically where they are. And that is where, for all of us, is putting some pressure on, rightly so, for us to commit even more to the alliance. So the UK is basically kind of all in with most of our capabilities, including right up to nuclear. But there are important underpinning strands as well. One of the big successes from Washington was that we now have 23 allies at 2% or more. And now every single ally has a plan to get to 2%. Personally, I think we're going to have to move beyond 2% at some point in the not too distant future. And those who are working toward 2% need to get there even quicker. But when you think back to 2014, when we only had 3 allies, getting to 23 is a big win. And also the focus on defence industrial, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a big priority in our strategic defence review. But I think in the last 2 years here at NATO, I think we've probably focused on that as much as any other single issue. Because, okay, you can have all the plans you like in the world, if you don't have the defence industrial base to sustain them at the same time as we're sustaining our support for Ukraine. So I think it was a good package. It didn't have all the headlines perhaps that some previous summits have had, but that is a positive thing, because it showed actually how much progress we've made in recent years. And it is always worth reminding ourselves, this is the biggest transformation of NATO deterrence and defence since the end of the Cold War.
I want to turn to the defence industrial production in a second, but let me ask you, because I sort of hear that NATO is spending a lot more, countries are doing a lot more in defence. It's clear that defense and deterrence is a major focus. On the other hand, countries like Germany and others, I don't mean to pick on the Germans here, enter when Russia invaded Ukraine, only had a few days of artillery stocks. And I can't imagine that has actually gotten a lot better over the last 2 years, especially as countries are doing everything they can to support Ukraine, or doing as much, quite a lot to support Ukraine. And the European aid levels to Ukraine have been incredibly significant. And indeed, one of the major deliverables from the summit is the delivery and transfer of Patriot systems that are in stock by the alliance. And so my question is there a competition in some ways, or a challenge of both supporting Ukraine and improving NATO readiness? And has NATO readiness actually improved, despite the fact that the entire old Soviet stockpiles of Eastern European members, which in some ways were as we've seen in Ukraine, useful, are now gone, and in a lot of excess equipment, a lot of reserves equipment is now gone because it's been given to Ukraine. Is there a challenge of balancing NATO preparedness and support for Ukraine?
So I think that one of the things that is driving this extraordinary focus on deterrence and defence, but particularly the defence investment and the defence industrial agendas, is that leaders can see very clearly that you can't do one or the other here. That it would be a serious mistake to say, okay, we're just going to focus on deterrence and defence for the alliance, or we're just going to do Ukraine. It is absolutely clear that we need to do both. It is also clear that we might need to do both for many years to come. I mean, obviously, we all hope that this conflict provoked by Putin's illegal invasion will come to an end soon, but we have to be ready for it to continue, possibly for years to come. And so the challenge for us all is to be able to do both of those things, to be restocking ourselves, making sure that we've got the right capabilities, but also the right kit, the right people to keep boosting our own deterrence and defence, at the same time that we continue to provide Ukraine with the support that it needs. Because as we saw earlier in the year, when that support tails off, even for a short period, it can have very negative consequences for the Ukrainians. So I think that's the world we're in. And that's why I think our government, like many others, are concluding that 2% is great, it's an important step forward, but it is just not enough over time. And we need to be ready we need to be preparing our publics for the need to spend well above 2% for many years, possibly decades to come.
Maybe let's now turn to the defense industrial topic, and we go into some depth. There on I think it was early in the week of the NATO summit, there was a day-long, I think, side exercise or side discussions with many industry, hosted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, spoke, a number of other people. But really, the U.S. was very much highlighting this concept of co-production, of potentially a transatlantic defense industrial base, which I believe gave the French a lot of heart palpitations. But how do you see defense industrial production and NATO's role? Because I guess where I come from is I sort of see some challenges on the U.S. side, really changing our own approach. When Congress devotes money to the Pentagon, it wants that money to be spent inside the U.S. We have very strict technology controls, the infamous ITAR, which I helped oversee for a time at the State Department. And so I'm curious, is this talk of kind of co-production, transatlantic defense industrial base, is it real, or is this just sort of a way for the U.S. to kind of partner with some European companies and sell a bit more American weapons in Europe? How does the UK kind of see the co-production issue question and NATO's role in it?
It's got to be real, because I don't think we will succeed unless we make it real. And we had the Defence Production Action Plan out of Vilnius. We've got the Defence Industrial Pledge out of Washington. And I think that just speaks to the urgency of the agenda. And NATO's got an important role to play in a number of areas. We are not short of NATO standards. NATO sets standards in all kinds of areas. But allies, including the UK, but almost all allies, are guilty of not observing those standards over the years. So it was one of the hard lessons we've all learned. We're all trying to supply 155 artillery to the Ukrainians. Well, it turns out that quite a bit of it you can't use in each other's kit. because we haven't observed the necessary NATO standardization processes. So NATO needs to get tougher with us, and we need to be tough with ourselves about implementing those standards. Secondly, we've got to be breaking down barriers to international cooperation wherever we can. For the UK, most of our most important defence industrial projects are transnational. The AUKUS programme with the US and Australia, our combat air programme with Italy and Japan, all of us bring different capabilities to this. And as we've seen, and I think as we sometimes have concerns with the EU's approach, if you set up barriers to international cooperation, it just won't work, given that all of our defence industries are so intimately connected these days. So I think NATO needs to help us break down those barriers wherever it can. But critically, and I think this is the really clear message from industry, we must get into more longer-term, multi-year, multinational procurement initiatives. It just makes no sense when we're all in this dangerous world together for us to be procuring on an ever more kind of exquisite national basis, when in fact we need to come together and say, okay, we'll each get 80% of our spec on this, but that will send a clear demand signal to industry. That demand signal will run for years and years. Industry can therefore increase its investment, confident in the knowledge that the demand will come. That has to be the route. We've all gone to national, to short term, and in some cases too exquisite in all of this. So there's got to be some rationalisation. And all of those areas, I think NATO's got a big role to play.
Let me, you mentioned the EU. Maybe let me ask you about the EU's potential role in defense industrial production. Where, I guess on Thursday, we'll see if Ursula von der Leyen gets confirmed as EU Commission President for a second term. But there's been a lot of talk in the EU about really focusing on defense as part of the next 5-year commission. There's proposals for the EU to sort of help get countries to sort of buy the same kit and potentially devote real resources. Right now, there's not that much money devoted, but there's prospects for a significant influx of EU funding into the defense industrial space. The Commission at least released an EU defense industrial strategy, sitting both at NATO and at the UK. And one of the major differences also with the changeover is a different approach, perhaps to the EU from this current UK government. How does the UK see the EU defense industrial plans, and are there concerns, or are you encouraging of the EU to perhaps do more?
So all of Europe, broadly defined, needs to do more in terms of deterrence and defence, including defence industrial. So we welcome efforts by the EU to step up on defence industrial, but it remains fundamental to our approach that this is best done in a way that promotes open collaboration and partnership. And if you look at our defence industry, we have some of, probably second only to the US, our deepest industrial cooperation is with France. With Sweden, we have extraordinary levels of defence industrial cooperation. Combat air, as I mentioned a moment ago, with the Italians. You just can't do this on a national basis alone, or if you're putting up barriers across Europe. So we very much support and welcome the direction that the EU is going in terms of increasing defence investment, increasing defence industrial activity, but it's got to be done on an open basis. And I think that will be one of the key themes of the discussion, as our Prime Minister has talked about the importance he attaches to a reset of relations between the UK and the EU. And one of his highest priorities within that reset is this idea of a UK-EU defence pact. And I think that will be the right vehicle to have that conversation about how we partner more together. We do better on standardisation, we do better on multi-year, multinational, and we do better in terms of forging an open, collaborative market across Europe and across the whole of the transatlantic defence industrial base.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the UK is sort of an integral part of the European defence industrial base. And so I think figuring out EU-UK cooperation, particularly in the defence industrial area, seems really crucial, given how integrated the UK is in every kind of major European defense system with Saab or with other French systems. Were there any big, we sort of talked generally about the defense production side. Were there any, concrete deliverables or other elements that came out of this summit that were worth the general public paying attention to?
Well, I mean, a lot is about commitment to future activity and about us all having national plans, making sure we're doing all of this work. But I think over the last year, we've seen the German-Dutch work on Patriots and production in Europe. We've also seen the announcement by some allies that they'll be working together on deep precision strike. I think there's a lot that's going on here and a lot in terms of developing international partnerships. It wouldn't all be up in headlines from the summit, but we're all feeling these pressures. We can all see that we're going to need to keep doing this at scale for many years to come. So I think you'll see more and more partnerships. We launched under the previous government our multinational procurement initiatives for both artillery and other forms of munitions. And I think you'll see even more of that to come.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, having served in government now a while ago, that from the outside, it's sort of, why isn't everything happening faster? And then when you're in government, you're like, there's problems emerging all the time, and all these obstacles to actually doing the things, that implementing the general policy direction. And it seems like on the defense industrial side, there's a lot of activity and energy, but a lot of problem solving that has to go in to resolving supply chain bottlenecks and production issues and other things like that.
Yeah, we are not in a Russian-style command economy.
Yeah.
We succeed because we are free, open markets with competitive industries. Much of the European defence industry is privately owned, not state-owned. So we don't have the same levers as the Russians, but we have vastly more resources. We have vastly superior technology, and we have vastly more effective means of collaboration. All of those things will tell. We just need them to tell a bit more quickly than is happening at the moment.
We maybe turn to the IP4, to the NATO partnerships, but I'll start with the language about China's support for the Russian defense industrial base has really gained, I think, a lot of attention here in Washington, particularly among Asia hands. Some of my colleagues in this building really took note of the strong language. I believe it called China a decisive enabler of Russia's defense industry. I think the view coming out of Washington is that, here in the United States, we can sort of complain to the Chinese as much as we want, but really China is more likely to listen to Europe. That if Europe speaks strongly and collectively and tells China to knock it off, that it may not work, but it'll have more likelihood of success. Could you talk a little bit about how you see that language in its significance?
So I think it is very significant language, and I think it's had some impact in Beijing as well, judging by the reactions there. When I arrived in NATO 2.5 years ago, I think some colleagues here still felt that if we were talking about Russia, if we were doing more on China, that meant less on Russia. This was somehow a zero-sum game. What we've really seen confirmed over the last year is the indivisibility of security between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. And that was a theme that came through from ally after ally at the session with the IP4 and also from our partners in the Indo-Pacific. You can't separate these two because, as we said in the language, which you correctly referenced there, China has been the decisive enabler over the last year of Putin's war machine. The support that has gone in from DPRK has been very significant. Same with regard to Iran. So I think it was a significant evolution of our understanding of the challenge here. And allies were determined to send a strong signal about this, that this cannot be cost-free for China if it continues to support Russia in the way that it has been, and that it might evolve in future. So I think that shared understanding came through really strongly in the session with the EU and the IP4 leaders.
If I could ask you, how difficult was it to negotiate that language? And I ask because, one of NATO's members, Viktor Orban of Hungary, had just gone to Moscow and Beijing, and was coming from Beijing on the way to the summit. Also, countries like another country like Turkey, very much wanting to have positive relations, not just with Moscow, but also Beijing. And so I think that took a lot of people by surprise. I guess how difficult was it to reach agreement on that language? And also maybe you could comment on the reaction to Viktor Orban in Hungary, doing this sort of peace tour effort with Russia in China.
Well, it was not the most difficult bit of the declaration to negotiate. And before you ask, I'm not going to tell you which was the most difficult. But no, I think it does reflect the fact that even allies who want to maintain a relationship with China, a positive relationship, or indeed even with Moscow, that this has been a significant evolution in the conflict over the last year, and it is worsening everybody's interests at the moment. And so I think it was a strong signal, and it deserved to be a strong signal, because that has been very significant, as I say. So allies came together around that assessment, and it's impossible to dispute, I think, the facts of the case there, that over the last year, China has stepped up its support, and that has had a critical impact for Moscow in sustaining this appalling conflict in Ukraine. Sorry, what's the second bit of the question was?
About Viktor Orban and
so a number of allies spoke about this. We don't believe it's right to have any kind of business as usual with Moscow, given the appalling conflict that Putin has unleashed on Ukraine. But also there is nobody that wants peace more than the Ukrainians. We need to be absolutely clear about that. They are not the obstacle to peace. And as we saw from what Putin said at the Russian Foreign Ministry just on the eve of the peace conference in Switzerland, he's still setting out the same old demands from before February 22, which are not a basis for negotiation. They're not a basis for peace. They are a basis for capitulation by Ukraine. If there was a serious basis for negotiation, I'm sure the Ukrainians would be ready to look at it. But that must be their decision when to negotiate and on what terms, not our decision, and certainly not a single ally's decision.
Yeah, I just completely agree with you. I mean, I think we just sort of ran a grand experiment since October of last year of what would happen if the U.S. stopped providing aid, and would that bring Russia to the table to negotiate? And the answer is no. Russia sort of doubled down on its maximalist war aims. So the notion of cutting Ukraine off will then lead Russia to negotiate, and that this is sort of Ukraine instigating, I think, was sort of disproven by the facts of the last year.
And also by the years and years of the Minsk process, yes, which I was involved in my former role. Ukraine negotiated in good faith with the Russians for years, attempting to find a way forward. And it was impossible, because Moscow was always trying to position itself as somehow a mediator in this rather than a party to the conflict, which was absurd. And so the Ukrainians have always been ready to talk. They've always been ready for dialogue, but on acceptable terms. And it must be them that determines those terms.
Let me ask you also about the IP4 countries. So this is countries of Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. 3 of the 4 heads of state attended the summit. This is now becoming sort of an annual tradition or routine, and I think it will continue to be. What is the significance here? What is actually, is business getting done? Or what's the kind of tangible results that are coming from the U.S. Asian allies coming to the NATO forum?
I was not alone in thinking that the discussion at Washington last week was the most substantive of the 3 sessions that NATO leaders have had with the IP4. And that theme about the indivisibility of security between Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific came through really strongly from speaker after speaker. And we can all see the challenges we are facing, whether they are from Russia or from China, whether they're in the new domains, cyber, space, how we deal with challenges around new technologies, supply chains, maritime security. That all of these, we benefit from talking to each other, from learning from each other's experience, and then identifying if there are ways that we can increase our practical cooperation. So we agreed some new flagship projects, as they're called, between NATO and the IP4, focusing on Ukraine and cyber and disinformation. But that political dialogue is also really important as well. It's always worth emphasising that we are not talking about taking NATO to the Indo-Pacific. NATO will remain a Euro-Atlantic alliance focused on the security of its allies. But what is really clear at the moment, and is felt, I think, by all the people attending that meeting, was that we enhance all of our security when we learn from each other's experience in those different theatres.
Yeah, let me do a quick plug for a report that I have out with my colleague Christopher Johnstone, who is our Japan chair at CSIS, on Europe's military role in the Indo-Pacific. We highlight also that there's a lot of defense cooperation, defense industrial cooperation happening between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And one thing is that as Europe modernizes militarily or develops its military forces, and also as the security assistance capacity of Europe grows, there could be real potential for engagement and cooperation. So it's already starting to build there.
We nationally, as the UK, we have unprecedented security cooperation, security and defence cooperation with Japan, for example. The Global Combat Air Program is one element of that, but it goes much more widely than that. We've got AUKUS, of course, with the US and Australia. We're doing more with the Republic of Korea, also with New Zealand, a traditional strong partner. So I completely agree with you that those defence relationships are thickening up very quickly, I think.
So, Ambassador Quarrey, I'm clearly not a reporter because I'm leaving the sort of juiciest political part of the question sort of towards the end. But this was a summit that was coming on the heels of a really monumental debate. NATO was front and center actually in that debate, and of course, President Biden's performance is the talk of Washington. And there's when I go to Europe, there's lots of conversations, discussions, concerns about what would a potential future second term of Donald Trump look like. So how did Washington's politics play into this? I mean, we're talking right now with the Republican National Convention going on. Donald Trump just survived a really horrifying assassination attempt, thankfully. How did America's politics play in to that NATO summit? And is there concerns about what would happen perhaps in 2025? Maybe you could talk about both the atmosphere and then maybe some of the policy implications.
Well, NATO is an alliance of democracies, and with 32 allies, it means that quite a number of allies are having elections every year. One of the reasons we've survived so long
before the summit.
Yeah, indeed, exactly. One of the reasons we've survived so long is that we don't do each other's politics in this. And the US has provided indispensable leadership for NATO for 75 years. We expect that to continue beyond the 5th of November, whatever the outcome of the US elections are. And I think a lot of allies took to heart what Mark Rutte, now confirmed as the next NATO Secretary General, said, I think at the Munich Security Conference in February, that we could all spend 10 months speculating about the outcome of the US elections and what it might mean for NATO, or we could focus our efforts and energies on getting the alliance into the best possible shape for whatever the outcome is on the 5th of November. And I think that's one of the reasons there was a really strong focus on burden sharing and on Europe stepping up. It's one of the reasons why 23 allies are at 2% or above. It's one of the reasons that we were talking a lot about how actually Europe collectively is providing more support to Ukraine, including militarily, than the US is. Because it's important that everybody understands that there is much improved burden sharing within the alliance. That needs to go further, but we're on a very good trajectory. So I won't do US domestic politics, but I will say that there was a really strong sense about getting the alliance into the best possible shape. We're in a highly contested world at the moment. It's in all of our interests for there to be the most effective burden sharing, with everybody making a proper contribution, including across the whole of Europe. And I think that's the right spirit to take into November.
That's sort of two more questions. One, about, you mentioned Mark Rutte, the now former Dutch Prime Minister, but long-serving Dutch Prime Minister, becoming the next Secretary General. There had been a lot of clamor and push for a female Secretary General, for someone from the eastern flank, and sort of reverting to a Western European man. What was sort of why Rutte, and do you think that was sort of a good outcome and a good process for how NATO got to its next Secretary General? This has been a conversation at each summit over the last few years as Stoltenberg has been sort of extended. But why Mark Rutte?
I mean, first of all, I should say what I said at the start. Jens Stoltenberg has provided truly exceptional leadership to the alliance over the last 10 years. We have to let him go at some point, and this is the moment. But he has been absolutely superb through the most challenging times for Euro-Atlantic security, and we are truly grateful for that. We think Mark Rutte is the right person to take over from Jens Stoltenberg. There's a very strong case for a female Secretary General. There's a very strong case for broader geographical representation at the top levels within the alliance. But this is one of the most important international jobs in the entirety of the international system at the most challenging moment for Euro-Atlantic geopolitics that I can remember. I mean, not just in my, certainly in my professional career, and possibly in my lifetime. So you've got to go for the right person. You've got to go for the best qualified person. And in our view, that was clearly Mark Rutte. He's got fantastic experience from 14 years as the Dutch Prime Minister. He's got them to 2%. He's been fantastically robust in support of Ukraine. And I think he'll bring all those skills and that experience to NATO.
Maybe sort of one final topic as we close out the conversation is what's next for NATO. There will be a summit next year in the Netherlands. What coming out of the summit, were there clear to-dos, things that must be worked on, or priorities that goals that are going to be set for next year? What should think tankers like me be focused on in the coming year?
I mean, there are many strands of work that have come out of the summit and that we need to be advancing as we start looking toward The Hague next year. A few of them that I would pick out, one is Russia. We have seen this campaign of hybrid activity in Europe in recent weeks and months, including in my own country. We've had a lot of discussion here about the right responses to Russia's hybrid activity. There was also discussion at the leader level at the summit about the importance of having the right long-term strategy for Russia, given the only realistic assumption at the moment is that we will continue facing a very difficult Russia for years and possibly decades to come. So I think there's going to be a lot of thinking both about shorter-term stuff and long-term strategy. I think there's going to be a big focus on further deepening NATO's international partnerships. We had the report on the South. We will have a new envoy on the South. But we've really got to turn that into much stronger political dialogue, including with, for example, the African Union and the GCC, but also more practical defence and security cooperation in areas like the Sahel. We've got a ton still to do, as we've discussed today, on defence industrial, and we must go into The Hague next year showing that we have moved forward on things like those multi-ally, multi-year procurement initiatives. And there's all that work in terms of making sure that we are generating the right forces and making them available to secure, so that he's got full confidence in the executability of the plans. And that point that we've discussed about the interconnectivity between all these different challenges, I'm sure will continue to preoccupy us.
Well, Ambassador Quarrey, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the hard work that you've done over the summit. I still can't quite fathom how a government changes over so fast. Being part of a U.S. government transition that takes months, for that to happen the next day and suddenly all new leaders are showing up. I can't imagine how much stress and hard work and everything that went into the summit. So thank you for all your efforts. And I hope you have vacation plans set up at least in the coming days. So, but I want to thank you for joining us the week after the summit.
No, Max, thanks very much. I enjoyed it, and it was great to talk. And thanks for all your support to NATO as well.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. I want everyone who's still watching to take out their phones and subscribe to the Eurofile, which we're promoting right behind me. That's our podcast that looks at all things Europe through a Washington lens. But thank you so much for joining us on this virtual event, and have a great day.